There are women who are chosen, and there are women who are used as a backup option. The difference between them is not their appearance, age, or number of social media followers. The difference lies in how their brains work and the signals they send to others without even realizing it. It lies in what happens in another person's nervous system when they walk into a room. I have been working in neuroscience and psycholinguistics for decades. I study how the brain processes information, how perception is formed, and how one being reads another. And here's what I know for sure: how others perceive you is not magic, it is neurobiology. When a man sees you as a luxury, as something rare and valuable, it is because his brain is literally programmed to react that way. And this process can be understood. And if understood, it can be influenced. But most women live in complete ignorance of this mechanism. They give, and receive crumbs in return. They try to be more convenient, more accessible, more predictable, yet men still do not value them. They think, what is wrong with me? Nothing is wrong with you. It is just that no one explained to you how this mechanism works. Today, I will explain it. Stay until the end, because the 10th key is the most unexpected. It is the one that explains why everything else either works or it doesn't. Today, I will give you 10 specific keys based on how the male, female, and human brain works. These are not magazine tips. Not be mysterious or smile more. By the end of this video, you will understand why one woman walks into a room and everyone turns, while another, no less beautiful and no less smart, remains invisible. Why one man is willing to wait and pursue, while another disappears as soon as he gets what he wanted, and what exactly in you, in your behavior, in your nervous system, and in your daily decisions shapes this perception. This is not a lesson in manipulation. I do not teach manipulation. This is a lesson on how to become yourself so completely that no one would ever want to treat you as an option. Subscribe and stay. This is important. Before moving on to the first key, I need you to understand something fundamental. Both male and female brains do not evaluate people consciously in the first seconds of contact. The limbic system does that. That part of the brain responsible for survival, emotions, and instinctive reactions works quickly, crudely, and ruthlessly. It reads signals even before rational thinking kicks in. These signals, body posture, tone of voice, gaze, how you react when you are ignored. All of this enters the other person's brain and forms judgments. A judgment about your value. We call these status signals. And here's what matters. It's not about beauty. It's about the nervous system, confidence, about whether your own brain believes you are worthy. Because if you aren't convinced of your own value, your nervous system broadcasts exactly that. And the other person's brain picks it up instantly before the first word is spoken. That is why a woman with average looks can be perceived as luxury, while a model-like woman can be seen as an option. It's not about the face, it's about the signals. This is exactly where the first key begins. I have seen it time and time again. A woman tells me, I know I deserve more. I know it in my head, yet she accepts crumbs, stays with a man who doesn't see her, explains his behavior, makes excuses for him. She knows it logically, but her nervous system lives differently. That is the problem. Cognitive understanding of your worth is one thing, but how your limbic system reacts to uncertainty, to silence, to a lack of attention, that is something else entirely. If you grew up in an environment where love had to be earned, your brain learned, I am valuable when I give when I am convenient, when I don't demand. And this neural pathway operates automatically. You don't choose it. It just switches on. Dopamine, the neurotransmitter linked to reward and motivation, is released when you are finally noticed, when he finally texts, when he reappears after silence, and your brain interprets this dopamine spike as this is important, this is valuable, this is worth holding on to. It is not a character flaw. It is the neurobiology of intermittent reinforcement. The same mechanism that works in slot machines. But here is what changes everything: neuroplasticity. The brain is capable of forming new neural connections at any age. This isn't just a pretty phrase for motivational posters. It is an established fact of neuroscience. This means that the belief I am valuable when I am convenient can be changed. Slowly, with effort, with repetition, but it can be changed. And change doesn't start with behavior, it starts with how you interpret your own experience when he doesn't text. Your brain says, maybe I did something wrong. A luxury mindset brain says that's his problem, not mine. When he pushes you to the background, an average brain looks for a way to be more convenient. A luxury mindset brain registers the incompatibility and starts moving in the other direction. This is not arrogance, this is a different neural pathway. And here's what is important to understand right now, before the second key. Everything I will tell you next only works if this foundation is in place. If your nervous system doesn't believe in your worth at its core, no strategy will help, because the other person's brain reads you like an open book. He senses the disconnect between your words and your body signals. You cannot pretend to be luxury, you can only become it. And the second key is about what happens on the outside when this foundation begins to strengthen. The second key, full presence. We live in an age of fragmented attention. Phones, notifications, multitasking. All this has made full presence a rare resource. So rare that a person who is truly present is perceived as something exceptional. When you talk to someone, you are genuinely there. Your gaze doesn't wander. Your thoughts don't drift to a to-do list. It is experienced as a gift. The interlocutor's mirror neurons literally activate. Oxytocin is produced and a sense of deep connection arises. This is one of the reasons why charisma is not a mystery. Charismatic people are simply present where they are. Their attention is not scattered, and this attention is perceived as valuable. But here's the paradox that most women do not understand. Presence creates a perception of value only when it is rationed. When you are always present, it is no longer a rarity. It is air. People don't value air. What does this mean in practice? It means that your attention is a resource, and you have the right to choose who to give it to. The third key, the principle of scarcity. The brain's dopamine system is activated, not by consistency, but by inconsistency. Neuroscientist Wolfram Schultz showed this in his research back in the 90s. Neurons that code for dopamine are most excited under conditions of reward uncertainty. This means that a person receiving your attention predictably and in unlimited quantities stops fighting for it. Their brain adapts. The reward system reduces its activity, not because you are bad, but because the brain is wired that way. I am not talking about manipulative games. I am talking about the natural consequence of having your own life, your interests, your projects, and your time, which you value. A woman who is always available sends the signal, my time has no value. A woman who has her own life broadcasts the opposite. Esther Perel, one of the most profound researchers of desire dynamics in long-term relationships, says this directly. Desire needs space. It cannot exist without a certain distance, without an element of the unknown, When you become completely predictable, desire dies not because of you, but because of neurobiology. This doesn't mean hiding or being cold. It means remaining yourself, fully centered on your own trajectory. And this brings us to the third key, which is actually a direct consequence of this. But what happened to one of my students when she understood this mechanism is worth telling separately. A few years ago, a woman came to me, I'll call her Natasha. Smart, beautiful, successful. A manager of a large project, and yet completely destroyed by a relationship with a man who gave her just enough attention so she wouldn't leave, and just enough coldness so that she would constantly try harder. She described it as an addiction, and she is right, is indeed an addiction, intermittent reinforcement. It forms a stronger dependency than consistent reinforcement. That is basic neurobiology. I asked her, when was the last time you said no to something that didn't work for you? She thought about it for a long time. I'm afraid that if I say no, he'll leave. That is exactly what her brain fears, and that is exactly what it broadcasts. Every time she agreed to something that didn't suit her, she sent a signal. My presence has no value. Key number 4. Standards as a signal of value. Standards are not the list of demands for a man. Standards are what you're willing to accept into your life and what you are not. And how you communicate that changes the perception of you radically. When a person sees you won't settle for less than what suits you, their brain registers that this woman knows her worth. This triggers a completely different neurochemical response than the one elicited by a person who agrees to everything. High standards create attraction. It's not intuition or romance. It is how the brain's value assessment system works. What is rare is perceived as valuable. What is easy to obtain is devalued. But here's what most people don't understand. Standards only work if they are real. If you say, I don't accept this treatment, but then accept worse, it's worse than silence, because now you also lose trust in your own words. And the other person's brain picks up on that. Key number 5, the power of silence. We are programmed to fill the silence, especially in situations of social uncertainty. When something goes wrong in a relationship, the first impulse of most women is to explain, clarify, and talk. Sometimes that is correct, but very often, silence says more. When you don't rush to explain and justify yourself, you broadcast, I am not anxious about your opinion enough to lose my peace of mind over it. That is a powerful signal of confidence. The prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for self-control and decision-making, is less active in people with high anxiety during moments of social threat. This means anxiety literally lowers your ability to react calmly. Silence in a situation where you want to speak is training for this system. And here's what happens on the other side. When a person doesn't get the reaction they expected, their brain starts working, starts looking for explanations, starts investing attention. You become a puzzle they want to solve. But I want you to understand something important before the 6th key, because this is where most people make the mistake that destroys everything prior. Here's the paradox that I observe constantly. A woman learns about rarity, standards, and silence, starts applying them, and things change. The man begins to try harder. Interest emerges where there was none. She senses that something is working, and at that moment she makes one of 2 mistakes. First, she thinks it is a strategy that she just needs to keep playing the part. Gradually it becomes a mask, and masks are exhausting. Eventually, she breaks down and returns to her old patterns because the mask is not who she is. The second mistake is confusing being closed off with having value. She begins to think that becoming a luxury means becoming inaccessible, cold, and impenetrable. But luxury is not armor, it is wholeness. The sixth key, vulnerability as a strength. Brené Brown spent years researching this phenomenon. Vulnerability is not weakness. It is the birthplace of deep connection. Neuroscience confirms that when a person allows themselves to be vulnerable, both their brain and the observer's brain activate neurons and the reward system simultaneously, creating what neuroscientist Antonio Damasio calls a somatic marker, a physical sensation of trust and intimacy. This means the following. A woman who can allow herself to be real, to show confusion, to admit fear, to say, I don't know, is perceived as more valuable, not less, because it is a rarity. Most people hide behind social masks. Vulnerability while maintaining standards is not a contradiction, it is true luxury. To be real while knowing you won't accept less than what is right for you. The seventh key. You do not explain your choices. This is what changes everything. This is something I almost never hear in conversations about relationships. A woman perceived as a luxury does not explain her decisions to those who haven't earned an explanation. She does not explain why she didn't reply immediately. She doesn't explain why she didn't come, doesn't explain why she needs time, doesn't explain why her standards are exactly what they are. This is not arrogance. It is the absence of anxiety or a need for approval. People who constantly explain and justify their decisions convey that they are not sure they have the right to act that way. People who do not explain convey that this is simply their reality. There is nothing to explain. The amygdala, the brain's anxiety center, activates when we feel we might be rejected. And it is this activation that triggers the urge to explain and justify. It is a defensive reflex, but it is what happens to the other person when you don't explain. Their brain registers confidence. Confidence is perceived as status, and status as value. Natasha, whom I spoke about, realized this after a few months of work. She called me and said, I stopped explaining. I just stopped. And for the first time in 2 years, he asked, what is going on? For some reason changed. Are you okay? She replied, yes, I'm okay, and nothing more. That was the first time he started asking questions, because for the first time, she felt she didn't need his approval. Key 8. Your life must be more interesting than him. I am not saying this as a provocation. I am saying this as a neuroscience fact. The brain is drawn to what generates its own energy. When a person has projects that excite them, friendships that nourish them, and interests that evolve, they exude a certain kind of neural activity. Dopamine, endorphins, serotonin. It is read literally. Esther Perel puts it directly. Desire needs to see the other as something a bit separate, a bit unexplored. A woman whose life is full remains that mystery, even when close. Even after many years, a woman whose life revolves around a man loses that mystery instantly. Her brain no longer generates its own energy. It is consumed by waiting, and it shows. It is felt in conversation, in the pauses, in how she reacts when he doesn't answer right away. This means your interests, your work, your friendships, your projects, they are not to the detriment of the relationship. They are its foundation. Key 9. You don't heal what was broken before you. This is perhaps the most painful of all the keys. We often choose people in whom we feel potential. We see he could be different if he tried a little, if he healed his wounds, if I waited a little, helped a little, just a little. And here is where one of the most powerful traps known to psychology works. The savior syndrome, the desire to fix what is broken, is built into us very deeply. For some, especially those who grew up with emotionally unavailable parents, this desire has become the primary neural route for building intimacy. Attachment is earned, love is proven, otherwise it isn't real. But that is not love. That is a repetition of old trauma. A person who sees herself as a luxury doesn't take on fixing someone else's brokenness. She is capable of seeing it with compassion, and at the same time understands it is not her job. It is the other person's choice whether to work on it or not. That is precisely why she doesn't get stuck with those who don't invest. Not because she is cruel, but because she understands that her presence near a person not ready to change helps neither him nor her. It simply prolongs the stagnation. And here is what happens to those who master this key. They stop being a magnet for people seeking salvation because the signal changes, the thing their nervous system broadcasts changes. But the most important key is the 10. And he explains why everything before either comes together into a whole or falls apart. Before the 10th key, I want to explain the mechanism behind all the previous ones, because without it, they are just tips, but with it, they are understanding. When we talk about the perception of value, we are talking about specific neurochemical processes. Social neuroscience research shows that the brain evaluates another person's status in the first seconds of contact through several parallel channels. Posture and how a person occupies space, tone of voice, and their confidence. Reaction to social stress. Does a person get embarrassed when ignored, or do they remain in the same state? The presence or absence of anxiety, approval in facial expressions and gestures. All this is processed by the limbic system before the prefrontal cortex manages to formulate a judgment. This means people decide how to treat you even before you open your mouth. And here is a paradox that I want you to truly hear. All 10 keys I am describing are not techniques. They are symptoms. Symptoms of one basic state. A woman who believes in her value at the nervous system level automatically does everything listed. She is present because she is not anxious. She is rare because she has her own life. She does not explain because she does not need approval. She does not fix someone else's brokenness because she knows it's not her job. This isn't a to-do list. It's a description of what a person who feels whole looks like. But what if that feeling was destroyed? What if it was never there? This is where the most important part begins. And that is exactly what the 10th key is about. Key 10. You don't become a luxury for someone else. You become it for yourself. I know that sounds cliche. I know everyone says it, but let me explain what it means biologically, because then it stops being a platitude and becomes an instruction. When we do something for the sake of another's approval, our nervous system is in a mode of orientation toward an external source. The brain is constantly scanning the environment. Are they approving, noticing, valuing? This scanning activity consumes a huge amount of cognitive resources. It creates chronic background stress, and it makes you dependent on things you don't control. When we do something because it aligns with our values and our understanding of ourselves, the nervous system works in a state of internal orientation. Neurobiologists call this state autonomous regulation. It produces completely different signals, calmer, more stable, more magnetic. That is why a woman who takes care of herself because she values her body and her time looks different than a woman who takes care of herself to please men, same clothes, same makeup, but different neurochemistry, a different signal. I will give an example from my own life. There was a period when I worked so intensely that I completely stopped paying attention to myself. Not out of laziness, but out of the belief that work is more important, that the personal comes later, that first you need to prove something and then you can afford, though I didn't really understand what exactly. And during this period, I noticed that people around me reacted differently, not because I looked worse, but because myself was not present. I was somewhere in the next project, the next article, the next deadline when I returned to myself, not out of a desire to please, but from the understanding that I needed it for me. Something changed in how people reacted to me in a room. I didn't change my appearance. I changed the focus of my attention. This is what I call returning to oneself. And that actually is the 10th key. Becoming a luxury is not a project for attracting men. It is a project for returning to yourself, to your values, to your interests, to your nervous system in its healthy state. But I want you to understand this does not happen in one day. And it does not happen just from understanding. Understanding is the first step. Next, you need practice. Let me give you something concrete, not an abstraction. Something concrete. First, every time you feel the impulse to explain your decision to a person who hasn't earned an explanation, stop yourself. Take a 3-second pause. That is long enough for the prefrontal cortex to take over control from the amygdala. Then ask yourself, why do I want to explain? Out of a desire to be understood or out of a fear of being rejected? If it is out of fear, do not explain. This is training. Second, find one thing in your life that belongs only to you. Not work, not relationships, not caring for others. Something that you do because it brings you to life. A language you are learning. A route you walk. A book that only you are reading. This is not selfishness. This is neurobiological hygiene. The brain needs sources of dopamine that are not connected to anyone else. This creates independence of the nervous system. And an independent nervous system is a magnetic nervous system. Third, every time you notice that you are accepting less than suits you, ask yourself the question, not why he is acting this way, but what this says about what I believe regarding myself. Because what we accept is no accident, it is a reflection of what our nervous system deems normal. And fourth, the hardest part, stop interpreting his behavior in his favor. Not because you need to be harsh, but because a kind interpretation of someone's poor behavior is how we convince ourselves to stay where we aren't wanted. I often hear from women, he's just busy, he's afraid of intimacy, he needs time, maybe. But if this repeats for months, it's a pattern, and the pattern says, you are enough. A brain that sees itself as valuable doesn't spend its time constantly deciphering someone else's behavior. It registers the pattern and makes a decision. This is where I need to add something you might not want to hear, but it is exactly what makes everything else work or fail. When I speak of neuroplasticity, I am talking about a real physical change in the brain. Every time you respond to a situation in a new way, not from anxiety, but from inner stability, you forge a new neural pathway. Each repetition makes it a little stronger. The old pathway, the one that said give more, explain better, be more convenient, weakens. It's slow. It takes effort and it's very uncomfortable at times because when you stop doing what you used to, your nervous system always raises an alarm. Literally, breaking a habitual pattern is perceived by the brain as a threat. That is normal. It means something is changing. I work with people who say, I tried, I lasted a week, then everything went back. That isn't a failure. That's neurobiology. One episode of new behavior doesn't rebuild the pathway. It requires repetition and more repetition. And further, research into neuroplasticity, specifically the work of Michael Merzenich from the University of California, shows that forming a stable neural pathway requires systematic practice over several weeks. That is a realistic timeline. Not one day, not one decision. This means knowing these 10 keys is the beginning, not the end. And here I want to say something rarely mentioned. You don't have to do this alone. I don't just mean psychotherapy, although it helps. I mean being around people for whom your standards seem normal, not strange. People who live that way themselves. If everyone around you accepts crumbs, it will be very difficult for you to choose otherwise. The brain is social. It learns from those nearby. Yada. These are mirror neurons in action. Choosing your environment is also one of the keys. And it starts with the question, do the people around me demonstrate how I want to live? Let me bring everything to one point. These 10 keys are not rules of behavior. They describe a state of being. A woman who perceives herself as a value within her nervous system. Key 1, her brain believes in her own worth. Key 2, she is truly present when she chooses to be present. Key 3, she has her own life and she treasures it. Key 4, her standards are real, not just declarative. Key 5, she knows how to be silent when she wants to speak out of anxiety. Key 6, she allows herself to be real without hiding behind a mask. Key 7, she doesn't explain her decisions to those who don't deserve an explanation. Key 8, her life is more interesting than any dependency. Key 9, she does not attempt to fix what was broken before her. Key 10, she does all of this for her own sake, not so that someone else will notice. There is a woman I met at a conference. She worked in linguistics, just like me. Let's call her Marina. She was nearing 50. She wasn't young in the sense that people usually mean. But when she entered a room, people turned to look. I watched her for several days. She wasn't doing anything calculated. She wasn't trying to please. She simply was. She laughed when she found things funny. She left conversations when they stopped being interesting. She spoke directly without embellishment. She ate what she wanted and refused what didn't suit her without apologies. On the last day I asked her, were you always like this? Oh. She thought about it. No, I was like this until I was 30. Then I spent 10 years trying to be convenient, and then I realized I was tired. And what changed? I stopped being afraid that I would be left if I were myself. That is the 10th key in a single phrase. I know you have objections right now. I can hear them even without seeing you, Tatiana. But if I stop trying, he might leave, perhaps. And here is what I want you to hear. If a person leaves when you stop being convenient, they weren't with you. They were with your willingness to be convenient. That is not the same thing. But I'm already so old. Who would want stop? I work with neuroscience, and neuroscience knows nothing of age when it comes to magnetism. It only knows the state of the nervous system. A 50-year-old woman with a stable nervous system, her own life, and genuine standards transmits a completely different signal than a 25-year-old in a chronic state of anxiety and approval seeking. Age is not a variable of perceived value. Anxiety is the variable, but I want love, I want intimacy. Is that a bad thing? No, it is wonderful. But there is a difference between wanting intimacy and needing it. The desire for intimacy attracts, while the need for it repels, because need creates pressure that the other person feels physically. And the brain interprets this pressure as a threat to its freedom and pulls away. You can want love and still be whole without it. This is not a contradiction. This is the very position from which love comes. I want to describe to you what the life of a woman who has mastered these keys looks like, not as a fairy tale, but as a concrete neurobiological reality. Her cortisol, the stress hormone, is lower in its baseline state because she doesn't live in constant monitoring of how he feels about her. This frees up a huge amount of cognitive resources. She thinks more clearly, makes better decisions, and notices more. Her oxytocin, the hormone of connection and trust, is produced from real contact with the people she chooses, not from anxious anticipation of his arrival. Her dopamine system gets stimulation from many sources: work, friendship, hobbies, not just from relationships. This makes her less vulnerable to manipulation and inconsistent attention. What happens on the outside? Men who are used to women accepting crumbs feel uncomfortable around her. That is not her goal, but it is a consistent pattern. Men capable of real intimacy feel drawn to her because her nervous system is in a state of rest, because she doesn't require constant emotional maintenance, and because she is interesting in her own right, regardless of the relationship. This is not a guarantee. There are no guarantees in human relationships. The brain is unpredictable. Everyone has their own history. Life is more complex than any scheme, but this is a change in probability, and it is a significant one. Let me end with this. I work in neuroscience and linguistics. I study how the brain creates meaning. And here is one of the most consistent meanings I observe in my work. People perceive you the way you perceive yourself. This is not a metaphor. It is a neurobiological fact. Your nervous system is constantly broadcasting signals, and other nervous systems read them before words, before actions, and before any conscious judgment. And here's what I know for sure. You won't become a luxury just by reading a list. You will become one when something changes within. When the neural pathway that says I am enough becomes stronger than the one that says I need to prove myself. It happens slowly, through decisions, through refusals, through moments when you choose yourself and it's scary but you choose it anyway, through pauses before responding, through a no said without explanation, through an evening alone instead of desperately waiting for a message, through a project you started because it interests you, not because it will impress someone, one decision at a time. I truly believe that every woman who reaches this point in the video already knows something about herself, understands something about where she is not living to her full potential, and this knowledge is already a start. If this video gave you something, write in the comments which of the 10 keys resonates with you the most and which is the most difficult. And this is not just a question, I read the responses, and they help me understand what I need to talk about next. If there is a woman in your life who needs to hear this, share it. Share it. Subscribe if you want the continuation of this conversation, because we have only just begun. And remember, luxury is not what you pretend to be. It is what you become when you stop hiding